In the year 1978, a one-legged Korean War veteran was quietly running the most profitable criminal crew in the entire Lucchese crime family, not from a boardroom, not from a social club on a guarded side street, but from behind the counter of a Brooklyn pizzeria. His crew pulled off the largest cash robbery in American history, and the teenager he had personally recruited off a street corner years earlier would eventually dismantle everything they had built together, brick by brick, from a witness stand in federal court. His name was Vito Tuddy Vario. If you have seen Goodfellas, you think you know who he is. You don't. Scorsese turned him into a background figure, a piece of furniture in someone else's story. Here is who he actually was. In the film, Tuddy is played by Frank Severo as a slow-moving, thick-necked man running a grimy cab stand in Brooklyn, shuffling between scenes, yelling about things that don't matter. His most memorable moment is berating a teenage Henry Hill over bloody restaurant aprons. He answers telephones for his more powerful brother, Paulie. He exists in the movie primarily to fill the frame while more important people talk. Martin Scorsese took one of the most operationally significant figures in the Lucchese family and gave him approximately 5 minutes of screen time across 2.5 hours of film. The real Tuddy was born January 20th of the year 1928 in New York City to Sicilian immigrant parents who had brought their family to Brooklyn when the neighborhood was still being built. While American soldiers were grinding through frozen terrain on the Korean peninsula in the early 1950s, Tuddy was among them. He paid for it in the most permanent way a man can pay. He came home to Brooklyn missing his left leg. For the remainder of his life, he moved through the streets of Brownsville and East New York on a prosthetic limb, walking with a distinctive gait that everyone in the neighborhood recognized from a block away, running criminal operations from behind the counter of the Presto Pizzeria and the cab stand on Utica Avenue that served as the crew's unofficial headquarters. Frank Severo walks on 2 perfectly functional legs throughout the entire film. The prosthetic is never mentioned. Not once. And that omission is not a minor detail. It is the detail that changes the entire logic of the story. Because a man who cannot move quickly, who cannot chase someone down an alley, who cannot handle the physical demands of street-level enforcement, who has to think about every step he takes before he takes it, that man requires something very specific. He needs a young, fast, completely loyal kid who can run numbers and deliver messages and collect from people who owe money without ever needing to be told twice and without ever asking a question he shouldn't ask. He needs someone whose legs work because his don't. He needed Henry Hill. In the movie, young Henry drifts naturally into Paul Vario's orbit, a teenager from across the street slowly pulled toward the gravity of the cab stand, like it was always going to happen that way. Scorsese frames Paul as the patriarch, the wise and distant father figure who recognized something in the boy and drew him in. The film gives Paul Vario the credit for Henry Hill's entire criminal formation. The real story runs differently. It was Tuddy who saw the kid first. It was Tuddy who made the decision. It was Tuddy who built what came after. In the year 1955, an 11-year-old Henry Hill walked into that peeling, paint-chipped cab stand in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn looking for part-time work after school. Henry was the son of an Irish-American electrician and a Sicilian-born mother named Carmela. He had grown up poor, one of 8 children crammed into a house on a block where the Lucchese family ran everything from the corner store to the construction unions. He later described the moment he walked into that cab stand as the day his real life began. He said he knew immediately that he had found the place he belonged. He was 11 years old, and his only ambition was to become a gangster. But it was Tuddy who made that ambition actionable. He put the kid to work from the first week. Henry ran errands, carried messages, served drinks at late-night card games, and stood in the rain holding an umbrella over Tuddy's head when the weather turned. When Henry's father discovered the truancy and attempted to pull his son back towards school and a legitimate future, Tuddy handled the situation in the most direct way available to him. He sent members of his crew to pay a visit to the neighborhood mailman with a straightforward instruction: stop delivering absence notices to the Hill household or face consequences that would be difficult to recover from. The mailman stopped delivering those letters. The school's correspondence simply ceased to arrive. Henry Hill's formal education ended without any official announcement. Then, on Henry's 14th birthday in the year 1957, Tuddy and his older brother Lenny gave the boy something that grown men with legitimate careers spent years trying to obtain: a union card in the bricklayer's local. The card placed Henry on a building contractor's payroll as a no-show employee, guaranteeing him a weekly salary of $190, serious money in the year 1957, the kind of paycheck that represented real security for families in that neighborhood. Henry did not keep all of it. A portion flowed back up to the Vario crew, as everything did. But the card also gave Henry daily access to construction sites across the neighborhood, where he could collect policy bets and loan payments from workers who had borrowed money they were struggling to repay. With that card in his pocket, Henry Hill dropped out of school entirely and went to work for the Vario crew full-time. He was 14 years old. Tuddy had essentially assembled a professional criminal from raw material, piece by piece, starting from a kid who had shown up looking for after-school pocket money. But the union card and the errands were only the foundation. What Tuddy and Henry did together next cemented something between them that the movie never shows and never attempts to explain. Their partnership went beyond delegation and errand running. They committed crimes together, side by side, with Tuddy directing and Henry executing. When a competing cab company called the Rebel Cab Company opened for business just around the corner from the Vario operation, Tuddy was not interested in absorbing the competition through negotiation. Late one night, Tuddy and Henry loaded a drum full of gasoline into the back seat of Tuddy's car and drove to the rival cab stand. Henry smashed the windows and packed the openings with gasoline-soaked newspaper. The building burned to the ground. Tuddy waited in the car. That was the nature of their arrangement expressed in its simplest form. Tuddy provided the direction and the authority. Henry provided the mobility. Literally. But the most consequential moment between them was not the arson. It was a pair of snow tires. The movie shows young Henry being arrested for selling stolen cigarettes, a brief scene played for mild amusement, suggesting a minor scrape that helped build his reputation. The real first arrest was entirely different, and Tuddy was at the center of it. What actually happened was this. Tuddy handed Henry and Paul Vario's young son Lenny a stolen credit card and sent them to a nearby gas station with simple instructions. Purchase a set of snow tires for Tuddy's wife's car, bring them back, done. Henry was 16 years old. Lenny was roughly the same age. When the two of them returned to the cab stand with the tires, two plainclothes detectives were already waiting. Someone had flagged the stolen card and the purchase had been traced directly back to the neighborhood. Both boys were taken to the precinct. During the interrogation, the detectives worked Henry hard. They wanted names. They wanted the chain of instruction. They wanted to know exactly who had handed him that card and what operation sat behind it. Henry gave them his name, his age, and absolutely nothing else. Not a single word about Tuddy, not a single reference to the Vario family, not one detail that could be developed into anything useful. The Vario family's attorney arrived, arranged bail, and Henry walked out with a suspended sentence. But the legal outcome was almost beside the point. Something far more significant had happened inside that interrogation room. Henry Hill had been handed a direct, personal opportunity to reduce his own exposure by giving up the man who had sent him on the errand, and he had refused it completely, without hesitation, without visible calculation. He had absorbed the full weight of the charge and kept his mouth shut. In the world of the Lucchese crime family, that was not a minor gesture. That was the test. That specific act of silence, that deliberate refusal to give up Tuddy under genuine pressure from law enforcement, was what established Henry Hill as a stand-up guy in the estimation of the people whose estimation mattered. Not a montage of vague loyalty gestures the way the film suggests. One specific documented moment, engineered by Tuddy, executed by Henry, observed and recorded by everyone who needed to know about it. Jimmy Burke, the notorious Irish-American hijacker who ran his own crew out of Robert's Lounge in South Ozone Park, Queens, and who was already operating one of the most productive truck hijacking operations in the country around the roads feeding JFK Airport, heard what had happened with the snow tires. He had been watching Henry for some time already, and what he heard confirmed what he suspected. Burke needed people he could trust with serious work. What Tuddy had built in Henry Hill, Burke now wanted access to. That errand with the snow tires set off a chain of events that would not fully resolve itself for over 2 decades. But we will get to that. Here is where the myth of Tuddy as a minor supporting character completely collapses. In the movie, Tuddy vanishes from the story after the early scenes. He surfaces once more briefly to escort Tommy DeSimone to his death, and then he is gone. The film gives no indication that Tuddy ever became anything beyond a low-level crew member taking bets at a cab stand and answering his brother's telephone. The reality is that Vito Tuddy Vario was a formally inducted member of the Lucchese crime family who rose to command the entire Brooklyn faction of the organization. When Paul Vario was convicted of tax evasion in the year 1973 and remanded to federal prison at Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, the crew needed operational leadership on the ground in Brooklyn. Paul was eventually released in the year 1975, but his parole conditions required him to maintain a residence near Miami, Florida, effectively removing him from the daily management of street operations in New York. Someone had to run things. The Vario operation was not a small concern that could manage itself. It was a structured, multi-layered criminal enterprise that Paul had built and maintained through his brothers like a family franchise, with each sibling controlling a specific piece of the overall operation. The oldest brother, Lenny, was a construction union officer and former bootlegger who had once been arrested in the company of Lucky Luciano. Brother Tommy served as a union delegate overseeing bookmaking operations across dozens of building sites in Brooklyn and Queens. The youngest brother, Salvatore Babe Vario, ran floating card and dice games and managed the payoff schedule to local police precincts. And Tuddy ran the cab stand and the pizzeria, the two nerve centers where the crew's daily intelligence, money, and instructions all converged. The Vario crew was regarded throughout the Lucchese family as its most consistently profitable operation. At the peak of its earning power, Paul Vario was pulling in an estimated $25,000 per day from illegal activity, adjusted for inflation. That figure represents something in the range of $150,000 per day in current money. The income came from three primary sources: the systematic hijacking of cargo trucks leaving JFK International Airport, loan shark operations running through construction sites across the borough, and extortion payments collected from every gambling operation in East New York and Brownsville. Any independent operator who wanted to run numbers, book sporting bets, or maintain an underground card game anywhere in that territory paid the Vario crew for the right to do so. There were no exceptions and no negotiations. The territory was theirs and the price was fixed. From the year 1976 through the year 1980, Tuddy was elevated to acting capo regime. He had final authority. He controlled the flow of money. He approved operations. He settled disputes. He ran the crew in full while his brother remained in Florida under federal supervision. And it was during Tuddy's tenure as acting boss that the crime the Vario crew would be remembered for took place. On December 11th of the year, 1978, 6 masked men entered the Lufthansa cargo terminal at JFK International Airport and walked out, carrying approximately $5 million in untraceable cash and $875,000 in jewelry. At the time it occurred, it was the single largest cash robbery in the recorded history of the United States. The heist was conceived and masterminded by Jimmy Burke, planned across a series of meetings at Robert's Lounge in South Ozone Park, but the entire operation ran through the infrastructure of the Vario crew. Paul Vario gave his approval by telephone from his residence near Miami. Tuddy was the man on the ground in Brooklyn, overseeing the daily operations of the crew while the most significant criminal score in American history was being planned and executed from locations that fell entirely within his sphere of control. The aftermath of the Lufthansa heist became one of the bloodiest chapters in the modern history of New York organized crime. Burke, consumed by fear that the number of people with knowledge of the robbery would eventually produce an informant, began eliminating participants with a systematic efficiency that alarmed even people accustomed to violence. The getaway driver, Parnell Edwards, was shot dead in his apartment 7 days after the heist, the specific trigger being his decision to leave the getaway van parked on a public street in Canarsie rather than destroying it as instructed. Crew members Robert McMahon and Joe Budaman-Ree were found shot execution style in a parked car. The body of drug trafficker Paulo Lacastri turned up on a burning trash heap in Brooklyn. By the time the killing stopped, at least 9 people connected to the robbery had been murdered in the months that followed. All of it happened on Tuddy's watch in territory he controlled. Scorsese cut every piece of it. The film frames the Lufthansa heist as Jimmy Conway's operation, with Paulie providing distant blessing from Florida. Tuddy is entirely absent from those scenes. He had already been written out of the story long before the film reached its most significant chapter. Why did Scorsese remove the man who built the crew from the inside out? Part of the answer is structural and practical. Goodfellas is Henry Hill's story told from Henry's first-person perspective. And by the time the major events of the late 1970s were unfolding, Henry's primary working relationships were with Jimmy Burke and Paul Vario. Tuddy was the man who had constructed Henry from the beginning, but the film needed to compress nearly 3 decades of criminal history into 2.5 hours of screen time, and something had to be compressed out of existence. But part of the answer is also about what makes a movie work on a visceral level. A one-legged Korean War veteran running a multi-million-dollar criminal operation from behind the counter of a pizzeria in Brownsville is one of the most genuinely compelling details in the entire story, and it fits nowhere inside the sleek, kinetic world Scorsese was building on screen. Frank Severo's Tuddy served the movie's rhythm perfectly. He was gruff, he was briefly funny, and he was designed to be forgotten before the next scene arrived. That was the role the film needed him to play. The real Tuddy was none of those things. He was a man who came home from Korea with one leg and walked into the family business and spent the next 3 decades constructing one of the most productive and feared criminal operations in New York City. He personally identified, recruited, trained, and tested the teenager who would ultimately bring the entire structure down when Henry Hill agreed to become a government informant in the year 1980. Henry Hill's testimony in federal court contributed to more than 50 convictions across the Lucchese family, a body count of careers and sentences that reverberates through organized crime history to this day. Paul Vario was convicted of fraud and extortion and died inside a federal prison on May 3rd of the year 1988. Jimmy Burke was convicted of murder and basketball point shaving and died in prison in the year 1996. Tuddy himself died on March 9th of the year 1988. Less than 2 months before his brother Paul, he was 60 years old. He is buried at St. John's Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens. He was never personally convicted on the basis of Henry Hill's testimony, a fact that says more about the limits of what even the most comprehensive cooperation agreement can accomplish than it does about Tuddy's actual role in what happened. Do not mistake him for the man in the movie. He was not the figure cooking sausages in the snow while more important men had more important conversations. He was not the comic relief shouting about aprons in a back office somewhere.